Before getting to the sort of meat of our topic today, I wanted to make a few kind of introductory points. I think when we're making any kind of, as Christians, when we're making any kind of response to some ideology, whatever it is, that's obviously opposed to Christian faith, I think it's very important that we don't respond in kind. It's a fairly obvious point, but scientific atheism today, as we all know, is sort of being pushed by the so-called new atheists. They're not particularly polite in their comments very often, not particularly gracious, and so I think there's always a temptation that we in the Christian community will kind of respond in kind. And I just put this verse up as a kind of reminder, to all of us, and to myself included, let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. And I just think this is an area where we don't want polarized opposition, but we want plenty of salty kind of responses, as that verse tells us. And I often think, in the context of the new atheists, I mean, as far as I know from recent polls, the actual percentage of professing atheists in the USA is only 4%. That doesn't, of course, include the growing number of nuns, so-called nuns, non-affiliated people, and so forth. But there's a temptation sometimes we can overreact, and it's a pity, I think. I don't know how it is here, but you'll have to tell me later. But in the UK, the new atheists have had a huge publicity in the media and so on. And of course, our proportion of atheists, committed atheists, is much higher in the UK compared to over here. But anyway, I think we need to have a sort of balance. Atheism over here is hardly a tsunami, even on the East Coast compared to down here. So we need to find some sort of balance in our response, whatever it is. I think gentle humor can sometimes be quite useful, and I'm all for a bit of gentle humor. There's some good books, actually, responding to the new atheism, which mainly use humor, actually, and I think that's part of it. Obviously not the whole story, but it's part of it. I don't know if you know whether it ever made it over here, but there was a bus campaign advertising there, if you can see it, there's probably no God, so whatever it says, enjoy life or something. Yeah, don't worry, enjoy life. This was partly funded by Richard Dawkins from Oxford, the new atheist. And then in response, some Christians in Oxford also said there's probably no Dawkins, so don't worry. And come to the Sheldonian Theatre. That's a big ancient meeting place in Oxford, where there was actually going to be a debate between Dawkins and a Christian person. Anyway, so I think sometimes humour can be helpful, and that's not what we're going to mainly talk about this afternoon, but I just wanted to flag that up at the beginning. I think it's incredibly important also that in our churches we give people a listening ear who have questions, and we really do find some really good questions for them, and that we have some adequate answers for people in our congregations. I sort of keep slight track of some of the, I think, tragic examples of those now, like E.O. Wilson, perhaps the best-known living evolutionary biologist in the world at Harvard, who was, I think, raised as Southern Baptist, was certainly raised as a Christian, went to church in his teenage years, and then, kind of was turned away, I think, from Christian faith because he didn't really receive adequate intellectual answers to the questions that he had. And I think those sort of examples, and of course there are many more, are always tragic because they're unnecessary. If people really get given, I think, decent answers, at least that can help them in their faith at the right time in their life. But I think perhaps the most important role that we have as church leaders is in getting across the message that the scientific enterprise, at least as it developed in Europe, over the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, is at heart, it's a Christian enterprise. And I think, as we all know, Christians played this huge role in the emergence of modern science. Modern science emerged from a theological womb, I like to say a theological environment, and in many ways it sort of belongs to Christians. And I think one of the striking features about the new atheism is the way in which they want to invest science with the ideology of atheism. They want to attach to science this tag, so that when people hear science, they're thinking atheism. Whereas I would want to say that science belongs to Christian faith as American football does to America, or as cricket does to England, or whatever it is, but it's really very closely linked historically. And I think Christians in the scientific community today are finding their natural home, I would want to say, as a scientist who is also a Christian. Now, I just wanted to, and I think this will come out now, I wanted to just play a short video clip, actually. These are folk that got interviewed by Ruth Benkovitz, who's a lady in our own staff at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion in Cambridge. And she wrote this book, it came out last year, called God in the Lab. And she went around interviewing various scientists who are Christians, and just getting a quick flavour of how they view their science and their faith. And I just wanted to play you that. Some of the accents you'll be very familiar with, others you might have a hard time with, but it's an international group of people here. So.
The more I've dove into science, the deeper I've gone, actually the clearer God becomes. And so it hasn't for me been something that's pushed me away from God, but actually drawn me in much closer.
When I have doubts and questions, I like to work those through and think about them on a deeper level, and I see that as part of my Christian faith, not as something that holds me back from faith, but something that makes my faith dynamic and more like exploring.
Science for me enhances my faith. Science for me allows me to see the intricate details of what has been designed and made by God. And my mind is blown away by the things that one can see down a microscope.
There are certainly questions that as a scientist one needs to think about if you're Christian as well. You need to think about, how do I read the beginning chapters of Genesis? I don't think you can be a scientist with integrity if you don't do that kind of thing. So again, I've thought about those things, and I think bringing that together has meant that actually now I feel quite passionately that as a scientist I really enjoy talking about my faith and how that fits in with being a scientist.
Understanding something about the world tells me something about God's handiwork and teaches me things that I can only learn by studying that handiwork in detail. But then studying His Word tells me other additional things about His intentions for me, for the world, and how I might fit into His plans for the world.
Okay, so that's Ruth Benkovitz. Some of those scientists, by the way, I know it's a very brief clip, but are really leading scientists in their field. The guy with the Irish accent, Harvey McMahon, is in Cambridge, fellow of the Royal Society, really one of the leaders in his own scientific field. Jeff Hardin there, chair of the biology department at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and so on. So there are plenty of Christians around in the scientific community, and there are some who are quite quiet about their faith. There are some, like these folk, who are quite vocal about their faith. They want scientists to know that they are Christians and that they're thinking about their science in a Christian way. I have 3 copies of that book, half price, $10, if you want to buy it afterwards, or some pamphlets if you just want to browse. And it's full of stories by scientists who are Christians about their own journey, about their own experience of being a scientist and being a Christian in the scientific community. So please do have a look at those later on. Now, of course, as we look at the present scientific community and see so many Christians really out there, so that reminds us of one of the key, again, this is all by way of introduction, but just one of the key facts that so many of those folk called natural philosophers in past centuries who helped to lay the groundwork for the disciplines in science that we enjoy today. These were committed Christian people who wrote a lot about how their Christian faith relates to their science. And really, there's just a few examples here. but you can just list hundreds and hundreds of examples of this kind. People like Robert Boyle, who helped establish what we now call chemistry, one of the key founders, the astronomers Kepler and Galileo, of course, many naturalists, John Ray, Linnaeus, other people like that, lots and lots of natural philosophers working in the physical sciences, such as, of course, Isaac Newton, not hardly an orthodox Christian, but certainly a passionate theist, Michael Faraday, after whom our own institute is founded, Clerk Maxwell, Eddington, just to name but a few. And I think it's really important that our churches, our church communities know about this, that they know about the history of science, a little bit of history of science. They don't have to be great experts, but know something about the history of the emergence of science and the influence of Christianity upon that. I think I'm particularly fortunate in living in Cambridge in this respect, because as you cycle around Cambridge, you don't want to go in a car in Cambridge. You'll never get anywhere. Okay, you have to be on your bike, okay, your bicycle. And as you cycle around and you look at the colleges, you're reminded of this history, this Christian history of science, everywhere you look. For example, cycling past Trinity College, you're reminded of Francis Bacon. He came to study at Cambridge at the tender age of 13, by the way. They started them young at university in those days. And it was Bacon who later did so much to stimulate the founding of the Royal Society, which is one of the world's oldest scientific societies. And so it was Bacon who later wrote, "No person could be too well studied in the book of God's word or in the book of God's works, but rather let them aim at progress or proficiency in both." And then at the same college, in Cambridge, by the way, there are 31 colleges that make up the university. Also at Trinity College, in the early 17th century, we find John Ray, who is often called the father of natural history. He came to study there. He ended up as a fellow there later on. And he wrote one of the foundational works in the history of biology, The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of Creation. And Ray chose to teach some of the materials in his lectures that later became that book in the chapel there of Trinity College, because he felt that science was just, and talking about science and teaching science was just as much an act of worship as being in the chapel and singing hymns and so on. So these early natural philosophers really did not see any separation. Of course, there was no separation between science and faith at that time. Theology, of course, the queen of the sciences, and so forth. Just soon after, John Ray, we have another undergraduate coming up to Trinity College again. Isaac Newton, perhaps one of the most iconic figures in the history of science, as I say, a passionate theist. He spent much more time in Bible study than he did discovering optics and writing about mathematics and gravity and so forth. But his real passion actually was Bible study. He spent hours in his room in Trinity College doing Bible study. But his theology clearly had a huge impact on the development of his science. He wrote a book, Principia, which is one of the most famous books in the history of science. It said that only 2 or 3 other people in the world could understand the book when it first came out. He writes there, "The most beautiful system of the sun, the planets and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being." When the Royal Society was founded in the middle part of the 17th century, it consisted mainly of Christian believers who really saw it as their mission to explore the wonders of God's universe. And the Charter, the 63 Charter of the Royal Society, declares that its activities shall be devoted to the glory of God the Creator and the advantage of the human race. And its officers were required to swear an oath on the holy Gospels of God. So it's almost started like a kind of Christian mission to understand God's world through science. And, no contemporary historian of science takes seriously the idea of a kind of conflict model which gives you a narrative to describe the relationship between science and faith down the centuries. Here's an example from Stephen Shapin. In the late Victorian period, it was common to write about the warfare between science and religion and to presume that these two bodies of culture must always have been in conflict. However, it has been a very long time since these attitudes have been held by historians of science. He wrote that back in 1996. I think it's even more true today. I think it's really important, given the present tensions between science and faith that we're familiar with, I think it's important that people know this history, they know something about it, they know something about how Christians pioneered science through their vision and activities. Okay, so that's all by way of introduction. Okay, that's just a few introductory comments. And let's now move to the heart of our topic today, the how do we respond to scientific atheism. And I want to talk about 4 confusions. I think they're confusions. 4 confusions that we find in the writings and other, lectures and so forth of these so-called new atheists. And I hope that as we consider these 4, what I'm going to call confusions, I hope those will, as we think about them, they'll help us to see how we can best respond to scientific atheism. First, clearly, is a confusion about the difference between science and scientism. I think, indeed, there's some danger in even of invoking a phrase like scientific atheism, because this might give the impression that there's something particularly atheistic about science, when, as we've just been thinking, there is definitely not. And I've got here sort of an attempt at a definition of science. It's an organized endeavor to explain the properties of the physical world by means of empirically and testable theories constructed by a research community trained in specialized techniques. Definition is not perfect. It's actually very tricky to give a neat, clear definition of science, but I think that definition does encompass many of the aspects of contemporary science. By contrast, the philosophy known as scientism often has been defined by the philosopher Alex Rosenberg, and I quote, as the conviction that the methods of science are the only reliable ways to secure knowledge of anything. And so scientism really is a philosophy parasitic upon science. Science, writes Rosenberg, provides all the significant truths about reality, and knowing such truths is what real understanding is all about. Once you adopt science, you'll also be able to cease treating the humanities as knowledge, close quote. Okay. So now you know if you're teaching the humanities, you're studying the humanities, basically it's not knowledge. Okay. So that's a fairly clear definition of scientism. Slightly depressing thought. It's very easy to illustrate the philosophy of scientism by quoting from a few more people. There are plenty of quotes around. Here's a quote from Peter Atkins, who's the emeritus professor of chemistry at Oxford University. He advocates the omnicompetence of science, he calls it, and believes that science, with its currently successful pursuit of universal competence, should be acknowledged king. So we have a sort of triumphalist narrative. Science will proceed like a bulldozer, getting rid of every block in its way, and eventually we'll be able to explain everything. Science has never encountered a barrier, says Professor Atkins, that it has not surmounted. And then, coming closer to home here, Daniel Dennett, he writes in Darwin's Dangerous Idea that Darwin's dangerous idea is reductionism incarnate, promising to unite and explain just about everything in one magnificent vision. Okay, that's a sort of, again, a triumphalist view that all of knowledge will be eventually wrapped up in these scientific theories in some way or other. Just one other example here, because neuroscientists often tend to move off in a scientific direction. This is Paul Thagar, professor of philosophy at the University of Waterloo in Canada. I quote, "What is reality? Those things and processes identified by well-established fields of science, using theories backed by evidence drawn from systematic observations and experiments." So notice that's what is reality. Okay, this is the definition of reality. What's real then in scientism is the scientific data, theories, observations, and so forth. And of course, in the history of ideas, scientism is the heir to the philosophy known as positivism, very much associated with the 19th century positivist Auguste Comte, who had a kind of evolutionary idea and a sense of ideas. He thought that every branch of knowledge passes successively through these 3 stages, the theological or fictitious, the metaphysical or abstract, and then the scientific or positive, as he called it. So he thought that every society was going to go through this sort of process, ending up with science as being really all that you need. And in fact, down below, you can't see it probably, but if you look at this book by E.O. Wilson called Consilience, the Unity of Knowledge, you find actually a very Comtean kind of thesis really through that book. So the ghost of Auguste Comte actually is very much alive, at least in the scientific community, not in philosophy departments, but certainly amongst scientists. And so you get this idea all the time amongst scientists who haven't read any of the history of science, and so they think, that you start out with superstitious religion, which just sort of explains everything, and then you discover that science actually gives you a much better explanation. And so you have a kind of inevitable progress, you see, towards this triumph of science and so on. And what's interesting, actually, about Auguste Comte is that he founded his own religion in the 19th century. It was called the Religion of Humanity. It was complete with places of worship and so on, where they worshipped humanity. And it had 9 personal secular sacraments. It had no less than 81 annual festivals. I've often thought they spent most of their time on holiday, because 81 is quite excessive. But you still find actually some remains, like this is a positivist temple from Porto Alegre in Brazil. And you find some in France also. It died out already in the 19th century. And it's very hard, of course, to worship humanity. I mean, if you're worshipping something non-transcendent, it doesn't work, basically. And it's impossible to keep going a movement which worships something which is so internalist and so minute, if you like, as humanity compared to something transcendent. So that's an interesting story in itself. But it was G.K. Chesterton who once archly observed that if there were no God, there would be no atheists. That's worth reflecting upon. So Chesterton was rather good at these little epithets, which might be useful for sermons. So if there were no God, there would be no atheists. So how then should we address the philosophy of scientism? I want to make 3 points here. First, if science could explain everything, then the only kind of knowledge there could be, by definition, would be scientific knowledge. Okay, that's the philosophy of scientific naturalism, which is sort of a big element within this scientism. There's no scientific evidence for naturalism. So since the truth of scientific naturalism cannot be scientifically demonstrated, it cannot be a valid form of knowledge, and so it suffers from an inherent contradiction. Now that simple argument, in a way, that's what killed off positivism as a philosophy in philosophy departments, basically. I was brought up with positivism in the 1960s in Oxford. A.J. Ayer was a famous philosopher, and he realized he did a complete 180-degree turn and realized actually positivism isn't going anywhere at all because it has this inherent contradiction, and you can't see, but somebody's soaring off the branch there on which they sit. Basically, that's what happens with positivism. But secondly, I think importantly, science cannot explain itself. I mean, many scientists just don't realize that they need to make a whole range of assumptions about what they're doing before they can even engage in the scientific enterprise. For example, you need faith that the universe is comprehensible, that it's coherent, that we have the potential to understand it, and so forth. And that might sort of seem obvious now, after centuries of doing science, but that was not at all obvious to people who really developed the modern scientific movement. Eugene Wigner, the physics Nobel Prize winner, once remarked that the miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of the laws of physics is a wonderful gift that we neither understand nor deserve. Very insightful quote. And so in science we also have to take on trust that matter behaves in a reproducible way. If we do an experiment this week and repeat it under the same conditions, that we hope if all goes well, we're going to get the same result next week, and so forth. And again, as scientists, we're very used to that. And it seems obvious, but in a way, when you start thinking about it, it's not quite obvious why that should be the case. I mean, why should that be the case? We can talk about laws and so on, but that just pushes back the kind of explanation you might want to give. And all scientists have to make the assumption that their minds are rational enough so that they can obtain some true understanding of the universe through science. You just have to take that as a starting assumption, otherwise you can't get into science at all. You can't prove that assumption from science itself. You can only get going with science once you accept that. as Einstein once put it, the most incomprehensible thing about the world is that it is comprehensible. It's the intelligibility of the world that is so striking, I think, as we look at it and wonder how and why that can be the case. And how can it be the case that human minds can at least gain some access into the truths of that world? Okay, so that's the second point. The third reason why we know that science can't explain everything is quite different, and probably kind of example that would relate much more to people's daily lives in our congregations. But it's just simply as a matter of observation. It doesn't explain most of what we care about, most of what makes life worth living. I mean, science is fantastic at explaining scientific things, but it's really not the right tool to give us explanations about the stuff of everyday life. If you work through, okay, this is a British paper, but whatever newspaper you want, if you work through it and ask the question, what relevance does science have for this particular story or that story? The answer, generally speaking, is actually nothing or very little. There are some stories, of course, where science does have a lot to say, but not many actually, because our daily papers are full of wars and politics and full of stuff that isn't part of scientific knowledge. There's something quite different. And so science doesn't really address those moral, political, economic issues that fill our newspapers. It doesn't give us answers to questions like, ought they to, divorce their wife or not, or something? Should we invade Iraq? I mean, who should be the next US president? I mean, whatever it is, you can just give hundreds of examples where basically scientific knowledge, science in the terms of the natural sciences, the way we normally use the word in daily speech in English, just isn't going to give the answers. Okay. And so I think that brings us to the second confusion that's very characteristic of scientific atheism. And that's a confusion about how different kinds of knowledge relate to each other and how various types of knowledge are justified. I want to pause at this moment just to flag up a sort of little model which I often find helpful in thinking about this. And we can call it, if you like, the complementarity model. Let's imagine that the whole of reality we call life is like a cube. And we can separate the cube down into many different levels, and each level represents one type of explanation or insight, understanding of the world. And then we can start labeling, putting them down as a list there on the right. So clearly we have a scientific explanation, which is asking questions like how does it work, what are the mechanisms, what are the generalizations we can make about the properties of matter, and so forth and so on. But then we have many other levels of insight into the world. We have ethical insight, clearly, which is asking the question, what ought we to do about that information? How ought we to act in the world? How ought we to behave in our lives, and so forth? And then we've got aesthetic insights, the whole role of aesthetics in the humanities and the arts, and what counts as beauty, and so on, a quite different kind of knowledge compared to the scientific. We have our own personal knowledge, our own personal biographies, which are unique to us, and which, of course, again, are not in contradiction with each other levels, but which are quite a different form of knowledge compared to these other forms of knowledge. We have then, of course, religious insights into the world, religion which is asking different types of question, which you can't see there right down probably below your level of sight. But why is there a universe anyway? What breathes fire into the equations? That's Stephen Hawking's question. What makes sense of the universe? How ought I to live my life? Is there a God? And so forth. So, and the whole point of this sort of simple model is just saying, well, every level has its own way of justifying its view of the world, its explanations, its beliefs. There's no necessary reason why any of these should be in contradiction with each other. We need them all. We need all these aspects of knowledge to do justice to this complex entity that we call life. Now, the danger, of course, of any model is we think these levels are isolated from each other in different compartments, so we're going to put a few arrows going up and down, and our own Faraday Institute for Science and Religion in Cambridge certainly about these yellow arrows, how do we relate these different disciplines and so on. But I think it's a reminder, that the folk, the scientific folk up here who say, well, my level of explanation and understanding of the world is the only one that counts, it's the only true knowledge. They're just not really taking into account the many different disciplines which give insight into the world around us. Now, perhaps we can, I hope, then see the problem with scientism more clearly as we look at that kind of model. And there are certainly plenty of other kinds of knowledge besides science that can be well-justified, rational knowledge. Virtually all disciplines believe that they are attaining such knowledge in the course of their inquiries. And each different discipline has its own particular way, its approach, its methodologies to justifying its beliefs, to giving us well evidence-based warranted beliefs and so forth. And in many cases, there's no good reason to think that the justifications provided are any less rigorous than those provided by science. Legal beliefs obviously require legal justifications. Historical beliefs require historical justifications and so forth. And so there are many ways at arriving at well-justified knowledge. And personal knowledge can be just as well justified as anything you might read in a scientific journal this week. For example, if someone's lived with a married partner for 40 years, and they're still loving them after 40 years by their actions and their behavior, and they say, I love my partner, that's based on 40 years of experience, that's a pretty well justified belief. Okay, I wouldn't want to say anything in Nature or Science coming out this week is going to be better justified than that personal knowledge that somebody has, that they have experienced over a period of 40 years. Okay, so many different forms of well-justified beliefs. And a common way, of course, of arriving at beliefs about things is known in philosophy as the inference to the best explanation. This was actually popularized by the late Peter Lipton, who is a philosopher, American philosopher, actually based in Cambridge. And it's, the sort of way we normally arrive at beliefs in our daily lives, very commonly, particularly in the more historical sciences also, such as geology, things like that. We observe a set of data, we see the skid marks on the road, we see a little patch of oil, we infer there's been a bad accident at that spot. We weren't there at the time, we didn't see it ourselves, but it's really almost the only possible explanation. It's the most natural explanation to explain the data that we have at that particular time. So that we do in our daily lives, almost, I was going to say by instinct, we just do that naturally. It's not scientific knowledge, but it's pretty good, reliable knowledge much of the time. Okay, so that's just a little bit about the second confusion. The third confusion that one often finds in the writings and talks also, I think, of the scientific atheists is a confusion about God, particularly God's role as the creator of all that exists. For example, I'm going to pick on Richard Dawkins again as my fellow countryman. I thought that might be appropriate. And when you listen to Richard Dawkins talking about God, you sort of realize it sounds a bit like he believes in some sort of superhuman. Well, here's a quote from Dawkins. It turns out to be the God hypothesis that tries to get something for nothing. However statistically improbable the entity you seek to explain by invoking a designer, the designer himself has got to be at least as improbable. God is the ultimate Boeing 747, sorry, forgive it. Okay, so, when you read those little comments, you think somehow this sounds very like a sort of God made in our image, rather than us being made in God's image. It's a God being made in Richard Dawkins' image. Something a bit improbable, a sort of superhuman, something very complex, therefore very unlikely. I mean, that really doesn't sound, does it, like the God of Christian theology? I think we'll have to agree. And so, personally, I have to say, I'm an atheist with regard to the God that Richard Dawkins doesn't believe in. And so, if I'm talking to a room full of atheists, I will often start by saying, I don't know if you realize today, but you've invited an atheist to speak, And they all kind of look a bit shocked because they invited a Christian. They wanted to have a debate. And then you go on and say, well, I actually don't believe, in the God that you don't believe in. And can I just explain that? And then you go on from there, you see. So we're all atheists, aren't we? With respect to certain kinds of understanding or misunderstandings about God and so forth. And I think it's worth pointing out. So I think it's very important as Christians that we convey in our teaching and our ministry an adequate account of what we mean when we speak of God as creator, which of course refers to the claim that there's only one really important duality, if you like, and that is the one that exists between God and basically everything that exists. So God is the ultimate source of everything that exists in traditional creation theology. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about material things, we're talking about immaterial things, we're talking about the laws of nature, we're talking about the periodic table, we're talking about Higgs bosons, we're talking about cats and dogs and us and everything else. If it exists, that is part of the created order in Christian theology. So that's the first thing to get across. And I think, part of the problem probably in this discussion comes from the way in which we use create in our daily language. Okay, so we then, of course, use this word create, which we use for all kinds of things, making a pot or whatever it is, and then we apply it to God. Now, the thing is, of course, when humans make things, they work with already existing materials to produce something new. And so the act of human creation is never the complete cause of what is produced. But God's creative act is the complete cause of what is produced. And I like this quote from the theologian Bill Carroll, drawing heavily from Thomas Aquinas here. God's causality is so different from the causality of creatures that there is no competition between the two. That is, we do not need to limit, as it were, God's causality and to make room for the causality of creatures. God causes creatures to be causes. That's at the heart of Thomist theology. Creation is not essentially some distant event, rather it is the ongoing, complete causing of the existence of all that is. At this very moment, were God not causing all that is to exist, there would be nothing at all. Creation concerns, first of all, the origin of the universe, not its temporal beginning. So sometimes my atheist friends say, well, what difference does it make to you as a scientist by believing in God? What's the point of that? I say, well, the point is there wouldn't be anything. Okay, let's get that clear. There wouldn't be anything at all. We wouldn't be here. Nothing would exist at all. And of course, it's this which renders the God of the gaps type of argument so implausible and unnecessary as we think about what scientists are really doing. Because scientists are describing the secondary causes whereby God, the primary cause, brings everything into existence. And so everything that scientists do, what they're doing is studying the works of God, whether they know it or not, whether they accept it or not. That's what's going on. So when I go into my laboratory, I've closed my lab now, but when I won't go into my lab, I know that there are atheists there, agnostics, there's just about everybody in there, all doing the same kind of science. What they don't know, or many of them, is they are studying the secondary causes whereby God brings about his created order. And I think that's very important to get across. And that's what makes this God of the gaps sort of argument, which crops up all over the place, both from believers and from atheists, so unsatisfactory and so theologically unsatisfactory. That's the key point. I'm sure you're familiar with this idea that here we've got a sort of cheese, yellow cheese, if you like, of representing the whole of scientific knowledge, but there's lots of gaps, represented by the white holes. And the temptation for people is to say, God is somehow belongs particularly in these white holes. God is the person, who explains the mystery that science hasn't yet uncovered. Well, it's a very, very theologically unsatisfactory way. If God is the source of all that exists, clearly that is a very poor kind of argument. And, we see it way back when, if you read the literal commentary on Genesis, Augustine, early 5th century, you find Augustine insisting that nature is what God does. Nature is what God does. So everything that we study as scientists is in some way, upheld and sustained by God. And so the idea of scientific ignorance being theologically irrelevant is a very curious kind of idea when you think about it. Why should my scientific ignorance in the year 2015 have any possible theological relevance? I don't see that argument at all. And so I think it's very important that we uncover that in our engagement with the secular world and with scientific atheism. Okay, well, we started a little bit late, so I'm going to take another 5 minutes just to talk about the last confusion, the fourth confusion, and that is a confusion about the meaning of faith. And you find that all over the place in the writings of the new atheists. Recently, I was reading this new book by Jerry Coyne, Faith versus Fact, Why Science and Religion Are Incompatible. That's a fairly clear title. And there, Coyne defines faith as belief without evidence. And you find that all over the place. And you find it in the writings of Richard Dawkins and so on. And of course, it's complete nonsense. And, the problem is that, as Cromwell knows, actually, no Christian theologian is going to accept that sort of definition of faith. But once you set up that definition, then, of course, it's pretty easy to play around with it and so on, as he does in his book. So I just want to make a few comments about that, and I will actually be expanding on this topic in the public lecture this evening as well. So I just want to touch on it now before we go into discussion. Now, clearly we can address faith at two particular levels. We can talk about a particular body of religious knowledge, the Christian faith, the Jewish faith, and so on, sort of slightly more academic type of discussion. And then we can talk about personal faith, personal trust in God for salvation. And so, again, we need to clarify in our discussion with folk exactly what kind of meaning we're attaching here to the word faith. And both of them, obviously, are very, very important. Again, that's going to be more of a topic for this evening's lecture. But for the present, I just want to emphasize that in engaging with scientific atheism, I think it's really important that we focus on this body of religious knowledge as evidence-based, as well justified, as intellectually coherent, and so forth, that we give a good rational, evidential set of arguments for the nature of faith. I think that is really critical, especially thinking of our young people and our congregations who are going off to college and so on, and we need to be giving them the tools, the understanding, the kind of groundwork that they will need as they face all kinds of questions as they do their studies and so on. Now, I personally don't believe that science in any way can sort of prove God's existence or anything like that. I think that science is simply not up to the Herculean task of really deciding between conflicting metaphysical worldviews. But on the other hand, I do think that a strong theology of nature, seeing the world through theistic spectacles, can be of great help in our apologetics and so on. I think in this context it's interesting to note that there are many striking similarities between science and faith, which I'm going to again talk about more this evening. One similarity I just want to pause on at this stage is their common quest for coherence. In science, as in faith, the key question is, how do we make sense of the data? Now, that, of course, raises another question. If we're thinking about metaphysical competing worldviews, what do we count as data? My suggestion is we count pretty much anything you want. We throw into the pot, as it were, all kinds of things, all kinds of disciplines, good and evil, personal experiences, psychology, social studies, music, history, whatever you want, put it in there. Because what we're doing here, what we want to do is say, well, taking on board our total experience that we have of the world through our academic studies, through our own personal knowledge, our own personal experience of relationships, and so on, maybe sitting and listening to, a wonderful piece of music, or whatever it might be. What's the most coherent metaphysical worldview that will make sense of that? Now, here we have, of course, our Christian worldview of a personal created God who creates the universe with intentions and purposes for it. We have atheism, which is basically saying, well, we have nothing beyond matter and energy. That's a brute fact. We just don't know anything else after that, and so on. And so we can start thinking about, which metaphysical framework makes best sense of that huge bundle of data, if you like, and I want to call it data as well. So, and I think that quest for coherence, as I say, is one of the things that is a commonality between science and faith. Now, we're not going to get perfect coherence in science nor in faith. They're both very similar. Lots of things in science that aren't really very coherent at all. And, clearly there are things in our own faith where we have big questions and the problem of suffering and so forth and so on. So we're not going to get complete coherence. But I think it's quite a good place to start sometimes in discussion with our atheist friends. So we notice, of course, that the atheism of someone like Richard Dawkins leads him to observe that the universe we observe have precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. When you look at the world through dark glasses, it looks pretty gloomy. Okay, it's pretty gloomy. But if you interpret the world within the framework of Christian theism, I would say that the existence of a Christian God who has intentions and purposes for the world is consistent with, for example, the anthropic fine-tuning of the physical constants of the universe, the fact that the immense size of the universe, with its 10 to the 20 stars, has to be there. We wouldn't be here unless the universe was as big as that, because time and space are absolutely related. We know that since Einstein. And then we have a dramatic increase in biological complexity that exists over time, over the period of time, and so forth. So the world, this is obviously a whole lecture in itself, but I mean, the fact that the Christian created God gives us, I think, a better explanation of the world we actually observe with all its complexity, I think, than atheism, and I think that's something we can bring out in our discussion. And in fact, in our papers that we write, we scientists, we often use the phrase in the discussion section down here, which you can't see again, but the results are consistent with our other results, or consistent with our favourite theory, whatever that might be. Okay, so we're drawing to close, and I want to just summarise then these four confusions: a confusion about the difference between science and scientism, confusion about how different forms of knowledge relate to each other, confusion about the nature and character of God, especially in creation, and a confusion about the meaning of faith. And I think if we grapple with those four confusions, we will begin to be on our way to being able to engage with scientific atheism. Two practical suggestions as we close. As I say, let's really take every opportunity, those of us who are ministers of churches, to speak positively of science in our teaching and preaching. I think it's especially important we don't, attack well-established scientific theories in the name of faith, that we demonstrate by our ministry that science is a friend to faith, and especially that, of course, as I was saying earlier, science was really birthed through faith. And let's make very sure that our young people go off to university and college well equipped with a good set of arguments that will help them as they face the challenges of their studies in the future.